Thank you for joining today's webinar on the NCPERS 2017 Public Retirement System Study and Dashboard tutorial. My name is Hank Kim, and I'm the Executive Director and Counsel for the National Conference on Public Employee Retirement Systems. Today's program is part of our Center for Online Learning, which provides remote continuing education to public pension trustees, staff, and other fiduciaries and stakeholders. In today's webinar, we will be reviewing the findings of the 2017 Public Retirement System Study that was released in January. NCPERS, in partnership with Colbalt Community Research, has been conducting this annual survey since 2011. What is interesting and unique about our study is that it gathers data from the full vertical profile of public pensions at the state, county, and local plan levels. We will also have a live demonstration of the study dashboard. The dashboard is a dynamic, interactive platform that allows users to adjust survey parameters so that you can see the data that is of particular interest to you. Leading us in today's webinar is William St. Amour. William serves as Research Director at the Municipal Employees Retirement System of Michigan and as Executive Director of Colbalt Community Research. We encourage audience participation. Please submit questions by using the GoToMeetings portal. However, to ensure that we can cover all our topics, we will hold your questions till the last part of the program. William, I'll turn over the webinar to you now.
Thank you very much, Hank. Good day, everyone. I hope you're doing well and keeping warm and not dealing with snow for those of you who had the storm come through. Let me give you some brief background on Colbalt. Colbalt is a spinoff from the Research Services Department of the Municipal Employees Retirement System of Michigan. So I've been in public retirement for about 20 years. Colbalt is a 501c3 not-for-profit research coalition, and we provide research and education to a range of entities, associations, retirement systems, local units of government, and so on. And we are based in Charlotte, Michigan. As Hank mentioned, we've been doing this for about 7 years. The goal is really to look at what are some of the practices that public retirement systems are putting in place and plan to put in place, and to get a much better sense of the most current data available on current fiscal conditions and steps that systems are taking to make sure that their fiscal and operational integrity stays strong. And also we wanted to take some time to identify some of the best practices and successes that the systems have had so that we can share them with the wider retirement plan community. A moment on methodology. So the surveys were sent out by email and by mail between September and December of last year. This is the same way in the same period that we've conducted it in past years. There were essentially two pools of respondents. There were NCPERS members, then there were also the largest non-NCPERS member funds based on assets and participants who weren't already in NCPERS. So it came out to around 500 funds overall. We heard from about 164 funds, which gives us a response rate around 33%. There were 86 funds who responded to the 2016 study and also to the 2017 study. So as I go through, there's a number of situations where I really want that apples to apples comparison of how that same cohort changed from 2016 to 2017. So I'll be mentioning that a fair bit throughout this presentation. The distribution of response in terms of the type of funds was very similar as past years, so that gives us good confidence in terms of comparability. So you can get a good representation on this slide. That'll about 48% came from cities and villages, about 45% were police and fire, 41% from county. And there are folks who might actually be in multiple categories, which is why the percentages don't add up to 100%. But you can see what the distribution is in terms of the types of funds and the people that they represent. So there's a series of slides that I'd like to go through, just pulling out some of the key findings that I think are pretty interesting and will be helpful as you navigate the year ahead. The first is that the funding value of assets, market value, now exceeds the actuarial value. And that's something that we haven't seen in a while. So one of the things that you may be running into is, and have run into, is when the actuarial value exceeds the market value, there have been some critics out there saying that we're masking our overall performance and that the actuarial assets and that picture is a little bit too rosy compared to the actual market. Well, we're now in a situation where the market assets are exceeding the actuarial. This is a good thing, but it does bring a different set of potential challenges. Historically, when this has happened, there starts to be a little bit of an argument that emerges that we are overcharging employers because our actuarial is understating what it is that we actually have. Investment assumptions are something that have been changing over the last several years. What we've seen is some stabilization in that area. So right now, the average assumption is 7.5%, which is the same as 2016. You can see that average band across this plot here. The horizontal is showing you the number of participants that each retirement system has that responded. Then you can see the percentage that they have in their investment assumption. So most folks really within a very narrow band with just a couple of outliers. You've got one down here that's a little bit below 4%. The investment returns at the 1, 5, and 20-year marks are actually very close to or even above those investment assumptions. So if we look at 2017, you can see that the 1-year return was 7.8%, our 5 years 8.4%. The 10-year still has some impact from the 2008, 2009 that's pulling that average down, but the 20-year, again, is right up there close to the 7.5 target. You can see what that looks like compared to the 2016 cohort as well. We did not include the 3-year mark in this study because it really didn't give us any additional information. We wanted to shorten the survey a little bit, so that's one reason that we don't have that comparable of 2017 to 2016. Next year, you won't see this gap in the data. Despite recent stronger returns, funds do continue to be pretty conservative in terms of the assumptions that they're pursuing. What we've seen is that about 85% of funds have either reduced their investment return assumption already or plan to do so. So there's more reduction to come. In addition, the smoothing period for investment returns continues to be shortened, makes it a little bit more volatile, but a little bit closer to market. So the average dropped from 5.7 years to 5.0 years. And you can see in this chart that really most folks are right in that 5-year mark or a little bit below. You do have some retirement plans that are a bit above that. One of the things we've seen in most of our studies is that retirement plans tend to be much more cost effective than some of the private sector comparables. So when we look at the expenses, we saw a drop in terms of the basis points to 52 basis points, which is down from 54 in 2016. When we look at the 2017 Investment Company Fact Book, which is a very interesting book if you need a little bit of bedtime reading, the average expense for most pure equity funds in the municipal world is about 63 basis points. And for hybrid funds that are more comparable to the retirement funds, it's about 74 basis points. So we're significantly above or below the cost of the private sector, which means that more of those funds are going into benefit levels or just generally providing a more efficient system for the dollar invested. Funded levels have changed, so as the investment assumption has fallen, we're seeing that the funded level naturally drops a little bit as a result. So it dipped to 71.3% for the most recent study. For an apples-to-apples perspective, for those funds that replied in both 2016 and 2017, we saw a little bit of a smaller drop. It went down to 72.9% from 74.7%. So still a little bit of a drop as some of those assumption changes affect things, but not a huge amount. This chart is showing you the distribution of funded levels. Again, across the horizontal is by the size of the plan based on the total number of actives and annuitants, and the vertical is the funded level. So the average is floating around right here, just above 70-some%, and the Fitch, which is one of the things that we use as a guideline, they like to see plans funded at the 70% or better. So you can see that most of the plans are above that. There are some outliers here on the bottom, and there's some really well-funded plans as well. One of the things that we saw that was really encouraging this year is that the plan sponsors, the payers, the employers, are becoming more diligent in making their full required contributions. The percentage of funds that have actually received the full contributions that they were supposed to get from an actuarial standpoint has increased from 70% to 74%. So it's nice to see that movement. Along with that, we're seeing a higher share of funding starting to come from employer contributions. The employer contributions rose to about 22%. They were 18% in 2016, and this is reflecting both that employers are making their full contributions and that those contribution levels are a little bit higher because of the more conservative actuarial assumptions on investment return. There's a number of tools that are available to you. The full report is going to be coming out pretty soon. I'm going to dive into the interactive dashboard for you here in just a minute and kind of walk through what kind of information is in there and how to work it so you get a better sense of how that works. And then we'll be going into the Q&A. When we go into the dashboard, there's something that you'll need to do on your own, which is download this Tableau reader. The dashboard itself uses Tableau as the interactive tool. The Tableau reader is free, so you just need to sign up for it. It's pretty easy to use, but you will need to do that before you download it. Otherwise, it'll give you an error and says it doesn't recognize what program you're trying to use. So at this point, I'm going to dive into here. So this is what the portal looks like. So the initial section, the landing page, is just giving you the executive summary, covering some of the key findings that we talked about in terms of the market value and the actuarial value, the trend of funds becoming more cost effective, the changes to the investment assumption and the impacts there, and the effect of those more conservative assumptions on the employer contribution rates. So those are all summarized there. Now there are a number of different pages within this document, and there's three ways that you can navigate. One way is just using the table of contents. You can click on it and it'll take you to each of these sections right away. Across the bottom, there are also tabs that correspond to each of these pages. So if you prefer to kind of go through in more of an Excel sort of format, you can do that to navigate. The third way is that up here there's a option in the toolbar that says Window, and if you click on that, it also gives you a list of all of the pages. So it's pretty easy to get around. So what I'm going to do is just give you a quick tour of how some of these different pieces work and highlight some of the information that's within it. So who responded? You saw this slide in the summary presentation, just looking at the mix of different types of plans represented and also the various plan types that are open within each of those systems. We also have a mix of the percentage of folks who are Social Security eligible, that include overtime, and that provide retiree health benefits. So some additional information. If you want to look at the 2016 results, you have the option of clicking on those and taking a look. One caveat that I want to throw out there is that this is looking at just those 2016 folks who responded to both 2017 and 2016. So it's giving us a bit more of that apples to apples view. You can see the total number of respondents with any of the selections that you make. So I mentioned there were 86 people who responded to both studies, and this is showing you those 86 with their 2016 responses. If we just look at 2017, we can see all 164 that responded. Other filters that you can apply is whether the plan participants are eligible for Social Security. So eligible, not eligible, and there were a handful of folks who didn't respond to that particular question, and so that's left here under the no response. One of the more interesting cuts I find is looking at the total number of actives and annuitants. Greater than 10,000 and less than 10,000. It's interesting to cut into this data to see how the data shifts, how the experience changes based on whether you are a smaller fund or a larger fund. From any of these pages, you can go to the table of contents to get back to this page and navigate. Or what I'll be doing is I'll just be chugging along this bottom set of tabs because that tends to be the fastest way to navigate. One of the questions that we ask is how satisfied plans are with their readiness to address retirement trends and issues over the next 2 years on a scale of 1 to 10. You can see that the average here is just above an 8, which is very stable, very similar to past years. So we're in very good shape. As I mentioned, you can adjust. If we want to look at just the larger plans, you can see that it's a little bit higher, not a whole lot higher than those smaller plans, but there are some of those shifts that are available that you can take a look at, and the charts do update dynamically. Looking at plan expenses, a similar sort of scatter chart that we've used in a number of the other slides. So the average of the administrative plus the investment basis points is across here in the center of the cluster, and then you can see the distribution above and below that based on the size of the retirement plan. Looking at investment assumptions, you can see here that the average is 7.47, so 7.5 with a rounding, and you can see that really across the board, folks are pretty tightly within a band of what that is, with the exception of a few plans. You do have the ability to look at your specific results. Everyone has their own specific code number, so you can get that from NCPERS and you can see what your specific results are. Inflation assumption is noted here, so you can see that the average is a 2.87, and there's a couple of plans that were lower, a couple of plans that were higher, but typically within a pretty similar band. Investment smoothing, same sort of thing. Most folks are right around that 5-year mark, with a few folks scattered above that. Amortization, so you can see what that distribution looks like that we talked about in the presentation. Another piece of information that's available on the dashboard is looking at the percentage of folks who have an open amortization or a closed. So an open is, for example, a 30-year, and every year when you're calculating your funded level and contributions, you keep dividing that out by 30 years, and that 30 just continues compared to a closed or fixed, where it's declining. It's 30 years in 1 year, and then it declines to 29 and 28 until it eventually gets down to 1 or some other level that you set in your plan policy. Again, looking at some of the differences in terms of the plan size, if we look at just those plans that are less than 10,000, we can see that a larger percentage of them have open as opposed to closed, compared to looking at the folks who have more than 10,000, where only 28% of them are rolling. So that's a nice example of how you can cut the data and look at some of these different attributes. You can also get a little bit more granular using the slider. So if you didn't like the 10,000 above and below, you can slide this around from either end and adjust what those numbers look like. Trends and plan changes. So there's a series of questions that we had looking at what kind of things you're doing currently and what kind of things you're looking at doing in the future. I won't read through all of these, but I will hit some of the highlights. When we look at retirement plan changes, the biggest thing that people have already implemented is lowering the actuarial rate of return, as I mentioned, and that's getting down to that 5% mark. And as we look forward, we can see about 21% are considering implementing that here in the next couple of years. The second area that's the largest is to raise the benefit age and service requirements, followed by increasing the employee contributions. Looking at the trends in retirement benefits already offering, so no surprise, most of you are offering a defined benefit plan, in-service death benefits, disability benefit. When we're looking at things in the future that may be coming down the line, we can see a bit of a growing interest in providing an ad hoc COLA, maybe catching up if things have been a little bit slower the last few years as plans return to better health. This is something that a number of you may be starting to look at. Developing potentially some sort of combination plan, so maybe a hybrid of sorts, or offering a defined contribution plan, or closing your plan to new hires and switching over. Looking at average cost of living, what folks are offering. You see the average right now is about 1.71%. You can see that there are a few plans that are offering more. So there's one here that's offering a 7.5. I presume this is a one-time catch-up kind of thing. And there are also a large number of plans down here in the bottom that are offering a 0% cost of living increase. Looking at business practices, things that you've already implemented, conducting a death audit, conducting an actuarial audit by a third-party actuary, updating, strengthening an asset allocation study. So those are three big areas that have seen a lot of activity. Looking forward to the next couple of years, things that people have on the radar, providing an online portal for members to access account information related to that, updating the administrative software that you use for membership data, enhancing member financial wellness, retirement readiness, and then looking at conducting an employer or reporting unit satisfaction assessment. So those are really the four that are getting the most attention going forward at the moment. Looking at member engagement, communication, we can see a number of you have updated your handbook and summary plan and have gotten that information out. Expanding retirement planning, again, there's that theme of really building that retirement wellness perspective, and then developing staff talking points on key issues affecting the funds to make sure that everyone's speaking with one voice. Looking forward, again, the expanding retirement planning education for members is really the top thing that folks are looking at doing in the next year or so, followed by conducting a member satisfaction assessment and actively using social media, Facebook, Twitter, and so on to do some additional message sharing and outreach. Communication capabilities this year compared to last year, very similar. So just about everyone has the capacity to send a postcard to the home address for your entire membership. Just over half allow board members the ability to participate via conference call and to vote. We have about 43% of the folks who have the ability to send an email to your entire membership. And about 38% of you have either a Facebook or a Twitter account. So you can see that's the number of folks saying yes, and then you can see, conversely, the number of folks who say no, they don't offer those things. Looking at oversight, the main things that people are doing this year in terms of oversight practices, conducting an actuarial evaluation at least every 2 years, board adoption and adherence to investment policies, receipt of an unqualified opinion from the auditor on the fund's financial statements. Those are really the top three, followed by board adoption of written fiduciary standards and plan receiving the full actuarially determined contribution in the last fiscal year. Similar to past years, but there's definitely a little bit of shifting going on. Looking at investment returns, we looked at these charts in the initial slides that I walked through, so you can see what those results look like. In addition, though, you can see the breakdown of the one-year return by asset class. So domestic equity, for example, was the strongest class last year, giving us a 15.4% return on average. Looking at how folks allocate their assets across these different classes, you can see that domestic equity is the thing that's receiving the largest allocation overall, followed by global equity and domestic fixed income. The second column is looking at the target. So this is the actual, this is the target. So you can see how close people are to those. And if you hover over these bars, you can see that comparison of the current to the asset, just to make it a little bit easier on your eyes. One of the things that we do want to point out is that if you add up all of these percentages, they don't necessarily come out to 100%, just based on how some of the folks reported their numbers. So some folks might not have been sure if their asset allocation was global equity or international equity, so they may have checked both. So really, this is an individual sleeve-by-sleeve basis, just to give you a sense for where people are. One of the things that you have the ability to do as well is play with these three little sliders that we've got dropped in. So again, you've got the size that you can play around with to see for the larger and smaller plans what their allocations look like. But you can also look at the folks who had the larger or the smaller one-year returns and you can shift that distribution around just to see what it looks like for the folks who performed at the highest levels or the lowest levels at both the 1 year and also for the 10-year. It's kind of an interesting thing to play with. We also have this breakdown of other asset categories. You can see other is one of the categories here in the list. So what does that mean? This is a word cloud where the things that came up most often in that open-ended comment, the more often it came up, the larger the words. You can see private, for private equity being one that's particularly large. But if you click on this, it's actually going to take you into the verbatim comments, so you can look through those and see precisely what it is that people were thinking about. Funded levels. So you can see the overall funding level along with the overall sources of revenue. You saw this chart again in the presentation, but you can see what the distribution is, and you can play with what that looks like for the larger and smaller funds, as well as whether they're receiving Social Security or not. Looking at health plans, we did add some questions on health plans back in 2016. We carried those over into 2017. Looking at the type of health plan that's offered, so none is 60%, and then traditional would be second place, with a few folks in a gap health plan or some other kind of healthcare subsidy. Who the plan covers, there's about 23% that cover both the actives as well as the retirees. Then you can see the percentage of folks who cover those various types of groups, retirees specifically, or the beneficiaries of retirees. And then last of all, we had a couple of questions looking at best practices. So we asked folks what strategies have they put in place to reduce their unfunded actuarial liability. And as with the other charts, if you click on this, it's going to take you to the verbatims, so you can see exactly what it is that people said. The second cluster is innovation or best practice themes that they think other retirement systems would be interested in. Again, you can click through to this to see those specific comments. But the top themes, when we pull it out, increased employee and employer contributions was a major theme for reducing the unfunded liability. Reducing plan benefits was the second one, especially COLAs and the benefits to new hires. Those were the areas with special focus in terms of reducing the benefit levels. And then adjusting the rate of return for the assumptions there. Looking at the best practice themes or innovations, a lot of focus really on improving the education. Not only for members, but also for employers, in trying to get upstream of some of the administrative challenges that you might be facing just in the way that employers feed information or some of the perceptions or misinformation that they have out in some of the HR offices. Offering a healthcare savings plan is something that came up fairly often in the comments, and then also increased use of data, metrics, benchmarking, those kind of things. So those are the some of the things that you can start to look through within the portal. It's a fun thing just to kind of poke through and play around with. If there is something that you wanted to grab and drop into a presentation, for example, so you sort it out, you're looking at a particular group of folks. If you wanted to steal a chart, if you right-click on it, so hover, right-click, you can go under Copy, and you can pull out some additional information that you can drop into your own PowerPoint or whatever kind of other communications that you may want to do. So those are my comments. Hank, I think at this point we'll be opening it up to questions and answers.
Great, thank you, William. So we have a number of questions. First that we have on deck is, what data on tax revenues and percentage of tax revenues going to funding ARC are available? As a liability analysis, it is hard to evaluate ability to pay without data on tax revenue or evaluate the possibility of future changes in plan structure and employee contribution requirements.
That is beyond the scope of this particular study. I've worked on other projects, though, where I've gone into some of the information available through the census on revenue for local units of government. And while that data is a couple of years old, it does give you a sense for what the general revenue looks like. And then you can look at what the cost is of the retirement plan and kind of back into sort of an affordability ratio. So I do recommend that you do that. In the census information, you can cut it into the data by individual states or even by the county level, I believe. Gets pretty granular, but there is some really good information if you have the patience and the skills in Microsoft Excel to do the carving.
So that said, just jumping on what William stated, regarding our annual survey, we're constantly looking to improve upon the survey. So if you think there are questions that you would like to see what your colleagues and contemporaries are doing, shoot me an email at hank@ncpers.org. And let us know what the topics or survey questions you'd like to see. And to the best of our abilities, William and I and others on this project, we review it over the summer before we send out the survey instrument. And depending upon how many people request it, or to what degree it's relevant to our overall goals, you could see those areas that you want incorporated in upcoming surveys. So I think this question also falls into that category, William, but I'll ask it anyway. Is there any industry-wide trend in the evaluation of cyber risk and the acquisition of cyber risk insurance?
I think the closest thing that we come to in this survey is looking at some of the oversight practices, and we look at this is the right place. We had a question along the lines of enterprise risk and also looking at security. I have to poke around. I know we do have a question along those lines, but it's really just, do you have a plan in place, essentially? PRISM, P-R-I-S-M, not PRISM. PRISM has a lot of information available. It is a public retirement system focused group. I know with MERS of Michigan, our IT director was a member of that. A lot of great information, a great network in terms of what folks are doing and what kind of things are coming down the road or that they're experiencing. So that's a resource that's available. But if we do want to dive into more cybersecurity kind of issues in the next survey, and folks are interested in that, again, let us know so we can dig into that a little bit more deeply.
Great, thank you, William. In regard to the data set, this is the 2017 study, but what's the time frame of the actual response data?
In the survey, we asked for folks to use their most recently published CAFR. So a lot of this is coming from CAFRs that were released probably as late as July of 2017, and then going back about a year from there. So typically it's that late 2016, early 2017 data, depending on when the year end was for the retirement system.
The next question, William, is in terms of contribution, is there data on the percent of payroll?
There is, and actually let me pull that up. In the paper report, on page 26, we added a chart looking at contributions as a percent of payroll. So you can see what that looks like overall. You can see that in 2016, the average employee contribution was 7.9, and that rose to 8.4. When we looked from an apples-to-apples standpoint for the folks who responded in both 2016 and 2017, that cohort had risen from a 7.9 up to an 8.2 in terms of the employee contributions. Employer contributions, as I mentioned earlier, with the changes in the some of the assumptions that caused the funding rate to drop, that caused the employer contributions to go up a little bit. In 2016, it was 18.5. Overall, for all of the responses in 2017, it rose to a 21.8. For the folks that responded in both 2016 and 2017, they rose from an 18.5 to an 18.8. So not a huge rise, about the same level of rise that we saw with both the employees and the employers sharing out that kind of increase. And then you can see the total from a 26.4 up to a 30.2 in 2017. And again, looking at that cohort apples to apples, it went from 26.4 to 27.0.
Then the question is, where can we find the survey and the dashboard? And William, if you could, do you have a browser that you can pull up?
I do. Let me first go to this page so that there are links. So the interactive dashboard link is at ncpers.org/members-only-2017 dashboard. So if you click on that, that'll take you into a login page where you can get that information. If you do need to get the login information, then Alyssa is really your person to talk to that can help you do that. But let me click through just so you can see what that looks like. So essentially, this is it. Here's your username and password information. You click in there, you log in, you'll be able to access the dashboard as well as the survey overall.
Great, thank you. Those are the questions that I have at this point. I don't see anything else on the portal. So let me conclude by thanking everyone for dialing into this month's webinar. At the conclusion of this webinar, there will be 3 short survey questions that we ask you to answer. It will take less than a minute. And the next NCPERS webinar will be on March 6th on the impact of the new tax cut law on public pensions in the states. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to your participation on March 6th. Thank you, William.
My pleasure. Thank you.